All right, hey guys, and welcome back. Today we're gonna switch gears as Hamilton sings. Let's get back to politics, please. So, Gilded Age politics. Remember that the government is this right here, the hands-off approach. What is it? It's the French word laissez-faire. Okay, which means that government is taking a back seat to business, letting business basically operate unhindered. This is called no regulation, because regulations are rules implemented by government to restrict business, basically like a minimum wage being imposed or environmental standards, things like that. Remember that the term Gilded Age to describe this era after the Civil War, the late 1800s, when we have industrialization, immigration, westward expansion, and imperialism taking place, was coined in a book called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in 1873. And the term gilded implies that there's like an outward shiny golden veneer, and then when you scrape away the surface, it's not all that great. There's something rotted inside in America at this time. And that rot is the political corruption that was rife throughout not only the national government and indicated by like the Grant administration and its many scandals, but also all the way down to like local politics. Remember, we talked about like corruption rife with the political machines and how you had basically businesses and corporations bribing the government to get their way. You could see that in this political cartoon pictured here, how you have these robber barons. Remember, these are the rich industrialists. Arthur, stop crying. Cat. You have these robber barons, these rich businessmen, giant, drawn, with all their greed and everything. It says steel, blam, trust, copper trust. A trust was like, remember, a monopoly. So again, these rich businessmen, the robber barons, and they're in the Senate chamber, looking over these little tiny guys, which are the senators, basically controlling them. All right. So, down to corruption at the local level in major American cities such as New York City, Chicago, and others, you had these political machines running the local city governments. And the most famous of the political machines that we talked about was Tammany Hall. Or the Tweed Ring. And it was called the Tweed Ring because their political boss was this guy right here, a guy named William Tweed or William Boss Tweed. Now, if you are a political machine, you're basically a group of men, kind of like a gang. You all work together in order to take over a city's government. And the way you do this is through securing the votes of the poor, the majority of the people that live in the city. Since so many of these people coming into the cities in America at this time were immigrants, that means you got to control the immigrant vote. And the way that political machines would do this is they would offer a bunch of public services, infrastructure improvements like building a new sewage system. People like having sewage systems. It's a whole lot cleaner than the alternative. You also had this time, by the way, the beginning of like trolleys and cable cars. That's going to be a huge improvement for cities over how it used to be when, you had horses all up in the streets, you know, leading the harnesses with the carriages and everything else. Horses poop a lot, and all that manure going in the city gutters was nasty. And so it's going to be a big improvement once you get the cable cars. And a cable car, like in San Francisco, is just like it sounds. It is a cable constantly running throughout the city, either above ground or underground. And the trolley car basically connects with a clamp onto that cable. So it clamps onto the cable, and then it's moving along with it until it unclamps, and then it stops moving. And that's how a basic cable car operated. And they start to have those, I believe, by the 1870s, 1880s. You start to have these cable cars. But yeah, basic public services. People like it when they get sewage and public transportation and water systems going. It's going to make the people very happy, and that's why they were happy to vote for the political machine, which took care of them. But the political machine was also rife with corruption. And so Boss Tweed, he would reward his loyal followers who went out and secured these immigrants' votes and recruited voters by giving his loyal followers key positions in the city government and administration. Now, Boss Tweed wouldn't need to become the mayor. He owned the mayor. He's like the puppet master controlling everything behind the scenes. And that meant that his government would give his companies all the best benefits, all the best contracts from the city to build new libraries, schools, city halls, everything, you name it. And in all of these construction projects, of course, he is going to be stealing a lot of money from the government, overcharging out the wazoo. We talked about how, like, in New York, one of the most famous projects for the new like city hall, they would overcharge by the thousands for like every single door and chair, and the plasterer, he got like an extra 500,000, which in today's money it's an obscene amount. But this is how the political machines such as Tammany Hall, they stole tens of millions of dollars from the city governments. And they just kept getting elected because of this spoil system. The loyalty they secured from the immigrants by offering these public services, and the loyalty of the local elected leaders to their operation, to their political machine and their boss, because they were getting this patronage. They were getting these political positions because of their loyalty. So that's one big example of corruption. You also have at the national level the most notorious example of corruption coming from the Grant administration. Ulysses S. Grant, really, really successful, efficient, the butcher. Uh, he had other names as well, but that was the most famous one. Union general that helped us win the Civil War. But during his presidential administration, Grant is going to be choosing a lot of people who are going to be taking advantage. And the most famous scandal under Grant's administration was the Credit Mobilier, which was a railroad scandal. A corporation had formed by an inner ring of the Union Pacific Railroad stockholders to oversee the railroad's government-assisted construction. Remember from the original Pacific Railway Act during the Civil War under Lincoln that the government was financing a lot of the construction of the railroad, or at least providing a lot of the land for free for the railroads to build, like the Transcontinental Railroad and others out west, as we wanted to secure development and settlement of the frontier. Essentially, this Credit Mobilier scandal, it enabled the participants to sign contracts with themselves at an exorbitant profit to build the new railroad line. The arrangement was protected by the distribution of stock to influential politicians. So like many members of Congress and members of Grant's like own inner circle, his administration, they were given stock in these companies that were basically, they were helping to get more profit to themselves. It was a big, scam. So that was with the railroads. There was also the whiskey ring where they basically sold off prohibition rights and stuff. There were many scandals at all levels. This was corruption from the 1870s onward. The effects of the Civil War dominated politics from 1865 to 1900. Basically, every Republican presidential candidate had fought for the Union Army in those years. And they had really high voter turnout throughout this time period. Let's see. So from 1868, when you had Grant elected, to 1900, when William McKinley wins his reelection, yeah, every one of those Republican presidents had been in the Union, fighting in the Civil War. The only Democrats elected in that time period from 1868 to 1900 was Grover Cleveland. Believe that's right. Yeah, Grover Cleveland. And Grover Cleveland is kind of interesting for a few reasons. Cleveland was from the North. A lot of the Northern Democrats at this time, who are going to be in the national scene, they were opposed to the high tariff that Republicans favored because the Republican Party is increasingly growing very close during the Gilded Age to the robber barons, to big business interests, to the industrialists. So the Democrats opposed the high tariff that Republicans favored, but the Democratic Party's leadership, like Grover Cleveland, the only Democrat that'll be elected during this time period, they were very closely linked to New York bankers and financiers, and they resisted demands from debt-ridden agricultural areas for an increase in the money supply. And so with Cleveland, he is elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. He's the only president to this point that's ever happened where he won, and then he basically loses his reelection to Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, by the way. Remember William Henry Harrison, Tippecanoe and Tyler too? He was the one that was only president for like 30-something days before he died from pneumonia, which he contracted during his inaugural address. Yeah, that guy. His grandson wins. And then Grover Cleveland, having only served 1 term or 4 years, he comes back to run against Benjamin Harrison in Harrison's reelection. And Harrison loses, and Cleveland wins his reelection after not being president for 4 years. So that's what I mean by serving 2 non-consecutive terms. He's the only president to ever like lose and then come back again. It could happen again, hoping it doesn't, if you know what I'm talking about. And the other point that's kind of interesting with Grover Cleveland is his name is terrible. Like a lot of these Gilded Age presidents, they're not very impactful. They're taking a back seat to business, and they have really weird, terrible names to remember, like Grover. But he was in his 50s when he married Frances Cleveland, she'll become. And it's interesting and icky because he had actually at one point been her babysitter. She was in her 20s when she married Mr. Cleveland, who was in his 50s. But apparently it was a very loving relationship, and they got along very well. And they have a daughter who, this is before the famous baseball player, but the daughter's name was Ruth, baby Ruth, or Babe Ruth. So that was interesting. And the whole nation was very much enamored by the beautiful young First Lady, Frances Cleveland, and baby Ruth. So that's the Clevelands. But yeah, that's a little bit about the politics at this time period. It's going to be dominated by the Republican Party. But you can see on the map that actually with the Republicans in red, with the Democrats retaking the South after Hayes's election victory in 1877 and that bargain of 1877, that Democrats strongly control the South. And it's really close. Like during the Gilded Age, politics was very similar today in the sense that most elections were like by razor thin margins, just within 1%. And you had 2 elections during the Gilded Age that actually resulted in the person who got the popular victory losing in the Electoral College. That happened both for Hayes in 1876, because Tilden actually beat him in the popular election, and that happened for Cleveland in 1888, I believe. In contrast with its ambitious initiatives, the federal government remained pretty small. In 1880, it only had 100,000 employees compared to today where it has over 2.5 million. That's not including the military, obviously. Yeah, the federal government was really small. It had grown pretty large under Lincoln, but then it shrinks back down. Like I said, because of the overall laissez-faire theme to the government at this time, it's going to remain pretty small for a while. The Republican Party supported high tariffs, reduced federal spending, and the repayment of the national debt, although not the debt of the Confederacy. That was outlawed with the 14th Amendment. And the withdrawing of greenbacks. Remember that the greenback was, and you can see a picture of it right there in the center of the screen, that was the currency issued by the United States, the Union, the North, during the Civil War, as we were needing a more flexible way to create money during the war, rather than it being tied to gold, which was very restrictive. And so they want to get us off the greenbacks. And Democrats, again, being tied to banks, just like Republicans were, they're not going to fight this. And so we will get off the greenbacks by 1879, and the United States will return to the gold standard. And remember, that means that the gold standard means that paper currency became exchangeable for gold at a fixed rate. Now, there will be a huge debate in America in the late 1800s, early 1900s about what money should be based on and about how to control and what should be the correct supply of money in our country. Many poor farmers and Western frontiersmen, they are going to believe that money should not be so tightly restricted. They want to have more money available, increase the money supply. And to do that, they wanted us to get off the gold standard, maybe by adding silver using what's called bimetallism, or just taking us off of it entirely. But that will be a thing we'll talk about later with like the rise of the populist party. So that is something to keep in mind. We do have some reform legislation taking place during the Gilded Age. It was very rare. I think it was only once that it happened where both houses of Congress and the president were of the same political party. So again, for most of the Gilded Age, just like today, the national government was pretty deadlocked, meaning it was unable to accomplish a whole lot. But before you are three pretty significant laws that are passed during the Gilded Age, which you should be aware of. The first one is the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. The Pendleton Act came about largely due to an assassination of President Garfield. President James Garfield was assassinated in 1883 by a disappointed office seeker. And this was part of the spoils system we were just talking about with political machines, how you reward your loyal followers with key government positions. It wasn't just done by political machines. Remember, Andrew Jackson, president in the 1830s, he was the one who kind of started that as an official process, this system of patronage. And it was very ripe in America during the Gilded Age. And so President Garfield, he had apparently promised this appointment to this man who did not get the appointments that he was promised, and he kills the president for this. And so the vice president who takes over, Chester A. Arthur, again, the names, the Gilded Age president names, I can't do anything about them. They're terrible. But Chester A. Arthur, he will, along with Congress, get this law passed, which will basically eliminate the spoils system. So that is a pretty significant thing. And that will diminish the power of the political machines in the cities as well. What the Pendleton Act did is it forced government office seekers to have to pass a government examination in order to qualify for that government job. So no longer could you just get a job based on your loyalties or who you knew or who your daddy was. Now you have to get the job theoretically based on your merits, merit being your skill. Are you qualified for the job or not? Can you pass this test, in other words? Problems with enforcement means that it's not going to be like immediately fixing all of the problems out there, but it is going to do a big dent in the spoil system and taking down the political machines and the system of patronage. So that's the Pendleton Act. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 is going to come around because of a lot of those poor farmers out in the South and the West who were very upset at the restrictive money supply we were just talking about. They're going to form the patrons of animal husbandry, and eventually the Grange movement, and eventually by the 1890s, the Populist Party. And what a lot of their political machinations are, these poor farmers, is that they want to try to have the federal government intervene in the corruption taking place with the railroad industry. Railroads were severely overcharging farmers in order to take their crops to markets. They were gouging them, jacking up the price because railroads knew they had a monopoly on transportation. I mean, what are you going to do? Put all your stuff in like wagons? Hello, you're competing on an international global market. You can't do the job that they used to do like in the 1700s, wagons or steamboats. You got to have the trains to move your crops, or you're just not going to be able to compete. You're not going to be able to make money, in other words. And that's your livelihood. And so farmers are going to politicize. They're going to become political in order to try to force government action against the railroad companies. And the result was the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Like a lot of the things in the Gilded Age, it's going to be pretty weak because it's not going to include a lot of government enforcement, but it is a big deal as far as changing this into this. And what I mean by that is, okay, this is laissez-faire. This is the hands-off. This is government letting those railroad companies charge whatever they want. This is hands-on. This is government regulation. This is the Interstate Commerce Act, the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which it creates, basically giving the government the authority to sue the railroad companies for overcharging farmers, for price gouging and price fixing. It's the first time that the government does this with corporations, that says, not so fast. You can't just do whatever you want. So it symbolizes a big departure from the laissez-faire system that had been previously in place during the Gilded Age. For the first time, the government's getting off of its laissez-faire butt and actually doing something to help the little guy, although it's going to be largely toothless. Speaking of largely toothless, the last law on here is the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, remember, trust means a monopoly, or kind of like a monopoly. Remember, when businesses kind of conglomerate, they come together in order to set prices, and they're going to be run by kind of one person. So it's kind of like a monopoly. So antitrust means that you are trying to break up the monopolies or not allow them to form in the first place. What the Sherman Antitrust Act did is it banned all combinations, so businesses taking over other businesses and forming one giant corporation. Can't do that. And practices that restrain free trade. So like price fixing and price gouging, like Rockefeller was famous for with his giant monopoly, Standard Oil, that is now all supposed to be illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. So this sounds like a good thing, and it should have been. But again, it was pretty weak. Its language was so vague that actually, in its first 10 years of operation, the biggest thing that the Sherman Antitrust Act is going to do is actually take on labor unions, which, as we will talk about, labor unions were groups formed by workers to protect worker rights. So whoopsie, Sherman Act actually kind of was used for the opposite of what it should have been used for originally. All right. Again, farmers are going to unite. First, they form the Patrons of Animal Husbandry in 1867. That sounds like a super weird name, so real briefly, let me explain. Animal husbandry is the practice of raising animals, like being a farmer or a rancher. There you go. The Grange movement is going to come about from that in the 1870s, 1880s. And then from the late 1880s into the 1890s, you get the birth of the Populist Party. And the Populists are going to be super important. When you hear populist, you think Grange movement, you think Patrons of Animal Husbandry. I want you to remember, bum, 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 bum. Remember that little ditty, okay? Because they are farmers, okay? That's who they are. These poor farmers are uniting for political purposes to try to get the government to look out for their interests. And they're going to have a huge impact at reforming the way government operated and ushering in a new progressive era. More on them later. And remember, we talked about this before with like conspicuous consumption, how the other half lived by Jacob Riis. The uneven wealth distribution at this time, you have a huge wealth disparity in the Gilded Age that is only going to grow throughout the 20th century, particularly from the 1980s to 2020, where we're at today, where you have the richest Americans, you know, becoming richer, these millionaires becoming billionaires, while you have a huge growing number of people who are living in poverty. In the 1850s, the English scientist Charles Darwin is going to publish his most famous work called On the Origin of the Species, where he basically creates the theory of evolution, where plants and animal species best suited to their environment took the place of those less able to adapt. Survival of the fittest, right? And I'm sure you guys know about evolution theory. If not, you're supposed to be taught evolution in biology class your freshman year. So maybe go back to biology. But the reason we're talking about evolution theory in history class right now is that In the Gilded Age, in the late 1800s, this theory of evolution is going to be twisted by many into a pseudoscience called social Darwinism. So, a pseudoscience is kind of like a fake science. It's taking real science and twisting it, not using scientific analysis or scientific, theory or any of that stuff, but just kind of twisting it to meet your own ends. That's pseudoscience. And this theory of social Darwinism, it's going to be basically where um, you have natural selection and survival of the fittest put onto social problems, put onto society, like it sounds. Um, I'm not explaining this very well. It basically justified that there were some people, it justified this uneven wealth distribution. It justified that there were some who were rich and some who were poor, and that's the way things were meant to be. So for many of these wealthy robber barons and industrialists and rich people during the Gilded Age, social Darwinism benefited them. This theory stated that they were rich and powerful because they were the most evolved. And the poor masses that were working like slave labor machines in their factories were always meant to be the poor masses because they were less evolved. That's kind of how social Darwinism went. The giant industrial corporation, social Darwinists believe, had emerged because it was better adapted to its environment than earlier forms of enterprise. So, giant monopolies that had formed were the highest form of evolution. It justified that nothing was better in the market than the free market and the laws of supply and demand. And it justified absolute laissez-faire policies. The government needs to back off and let things kind of go as they should and let business operate unhindered, because it was basically allowing itself to evolve naturally into the most beneficial businesses if left unhindered. The idea of eugenics we're going to talk about later, and this comes about more in the early 1900s, but eugenics is the idea that you can breed a better human being the same way that you breed like horses or dogs. We breed racehorses to be faster and stronger. Horses have been bred for thousands of years basically for these traits. You breed specific breeds of dogs, like you breed thoroughbred horses, you breed specific breeds of dogs like the golden retriever to be sweet and loyal and have that beautiful red coat. Eugenics is doing this to humans, applying specific traits that you want in humanity for those that should be allowed to reproduce or not reproduce. And eugenics, as far as like parents deciding on, what kind of kid they want, or you deciding, what kind of potential partner you want to marry because you might envision, having prettier kids with that person versus somebody else. I mean, that's fine. That's an individual choice. Where eugenics gets really nasty, though, is when it becomes legislated by a state based on someone else's ideas of who should be allowed to have children and who shouldn't. And the government will actually be implementing eugenics ideas like that in the 1920s and 1930s. In the 1930s, like in the state of California, they began doing forced sterilizations at insane asylums where they actually had patients without their consent and oftentimes without their knowledge going through these procedures where they would, perform a hysterectomy. Or they would perform a vasectomy. They would basically do a spay or a neuter on a person and take out their reproductive organs without their knowledge or consent. Many years later, when some of these people had been able to free themselves of the institutions and they found out that they were unable to reproduce, it was horrifying for them. But that was part of America's eugenics programs, and it wasn't just in California. It's going to be in many, many states, and there were other forms of eugenics practiced in the United States as well. Discrimination against immigrants, discrimination against African Americans. Other ways that this became legislated, as far as these people having undesirable traits in order to reproduce, would include things like the state marriage laws that prevented blacks and whites from being able to marry. So that's stuff we're going to be talking about. Social Darwinism also justified imperialist views of the United States, which we'll be talking about coming up with the Spanish American War. And when we form an American empire, what gave America the right to take over the Philippines? What gave America the right to dominate Puerto Rico? Well, according to social Darwinism, we were spreading our light of civilization and white American values to these poor native peoples who were so much less evolved than us. So social Darwinism could justify the rich imperialist social inequality taking place during the Gilded Age. It could also be used to justify American imperialism. And now, for the last topic of this lecture today, let's talk about the labor movement. A labor union is, again, when workers come together to fight for better working rights. And you have the beginnings of the labor movement because of the mass initiatives with labor in factories that we needed during the Civil War. The Great Railroad Strike, the first massive nationally affecting labor strike, is going to be in 1876. And the workers will be put down by force. Was it 1876? 1877, because it was President Hayes, the same Hayes with that bargain that left the South, basically ended Reconstruction. We'll send in the military to put down this labor strike in Pittsburgh. Workers, when they strike, they refuse to work. They disrupt the operations of the business until their worker demands are met. Many of the labor unions and worker organizations that come together in the Gilded Age, they're fighting for basic worker rights, such as an 8-hour workday, because many workers used to have to work for much longer. They would have to work for 12 to 16 hours a day. They also typically did not get the weekends off. Sometimes they would get at least the Sabbath or Sundays off, but a lot of times workers would be working 7 days a week, and they would be making, there's no minimum wage, so they would be making very, very little. So little, in fact, this was not a living wage in any sense, making less than $2 a week, working like a dog, 12-hour shifts every single day, 7 days a week, that it wasn't possible for the man to support his family like that. And so his wife would need to work as well, usually in a textile factory or a textile mill or something like that. And the children would need to work. And child labor was rampant during this time because, again, everybody in the family had to work because they just weren't making enough. And so in order to fight this, workers came together. They formed unions. The Great Railroad Strike, 1877, they disrupt the entire Eastern, basically railroad operations by refusing to work there, and they burned down the railroad yards in Pittsburgh until finally the army is sent down to stop them, and several workers are killed. Oftentimes, when workers striked during the Gilded Age, they were met with violence because workers are not being protected at this time. Remember, the government is laissez-faire. The government is letting business do whatever it wants, and business wants to take advantage of workers so business can make a whole lot of money. The very first major national labor union that formed was the Knights of Labor, led by Terence Powderly. And the Knights, they are going to reach their height by 1886, when they had over 800,000 workers. Some of the things you need to know about the Knights versus the AFL is that the Knights of Labor were super inclusive. They included basically skilled and unskilled workers. So if you're a skilled worker, you know how to do a specific job, you know how to operate the Bessemer process in a steel mill. If you're an unskilled worker, maybe you're just, doing that one thing on the assembly line, minute after minute, hour after hour. But the Knights of Labor, they would protect both skilled and unskilled workers, and they were fighting for their rights. They also had women included. They also had African Americans included. Again, that's what I mean by them being super inclusive. And they mainly were fighting for better pay and that 8-hour workday. And they led a lot of strikes. And like I said, at their height in 1886, they had over 800,000 members. The other major labor union that forms early on is the American Federation of Labor. Today, they are still around. In the 1950s, they joined at the CIO. So today, they're known as the AFL-CIO. But they were originally much more restrictive in who they would include. The AFL only included skilled workers and only white men, no African Americans, no women, no unskilled laborers. And they were led by Samuel Gompers. And as weird as it is, I always remember Samuel Gompers' name. There's a picture of him right here because he has these giant jowls and his name Gompers, it reminds me of Pac-Man. And so I think of him like chomping stuff. And so I remember Samuel Gompers Chompers. I don't know why. I know it's weird, but if that helps you remember him, then hey, there you go. Anyway, so both of these major national labor unions, they're fighting for better working rights, 8-hour workday. You could see in this picture here, let me move my head out of the way. You can see this picture here. It's a cartoon about labor unions. The workers are coming together, forming a giant fist. That fist in the air is populism, right? It means power to us, the people. And then here is the 8-hour workday. Again, they were fighting for that. So during the Gilded Age, they don't have that. We talked about how like 35,000 or more workers died every single year in factory accidents during the Gilded Age. Now, because workers are suffering so much during this time, the ideas of socialism and communism were very popular. Again, the dun 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 dun. The populist party, these poor farmers that politicize and come together to get more government control, that's what they want. They want socialism. Socialism is where you have a government with more regulations, more control over private industries and business. That's like what a lot of European countries have today. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I think to everything moderation, to everything there must be a balance. You know, it's Star Wars teaches the best lessons. You know, the forces must be in balance. You can't have too much capitalism, laissez-faire, or you have businesses, you know, taking advantage of workers and consumers. You can't have too much, you know, communism because then you have a dictatorship and everything being taken advantage of, right? So you need something kind of in the middle there. And so for a lot of workers, the idea of Karl Marx, you know, was attractive, that the workers would rise up, overthrow the established system, and create a workers' paradise where everybody would be treated equal, everybody would receive equal pay. No more of this wealth and income inequality where you had these millionaires in their 5 mansions with their 50 rooms apiece, you know, living next door to the tenements where a family of 10 is crowded into a room smaller than, you know, your closet. So this idea was very attractive, but for mainstream America, communism was horrifying. It was basically anarchy. It was calling for workers to overthrow the government, calling for open revolution, and so that was not going to be tolerated. Lawrence Gronlund, he comes up with the cooperative commonwealth idea. And this idea was much more appealing for Americans because it basically said that a worker's paradise could more naturally develop instead of through revolution. It could naturally form in the United States. But we will see socialist and even communist candidates running for office throughout states in the Gilded Age, and even into the early 1900s, there will be some noted communist candidates for president, including Eugene Debs, who actually campaigned from jail. He was a lawyer helping many of the unions and getting arrested during labor strikes. He will campaign from jail in the election of 1912 and actually receive 6% of the American electorate, 6% of the vote in 1912. The social gospel movement is where you have many Protestant reformers pushing for more equal wealth distribution. Now, remember that you didn't have a lot of the social reform movement in the South from the 1800s. It was mostly like, remember the burnt over district and everything from the Second Great Awakening? That was mostly in the North, like in New York and stuff. The South was not big on the reform movements because, remember, one of the biggest reform movements in the 1800s was abolition. And we can understand why Southerners probably were not too in favor of abolition because they fought a civil war in order to avoid it, right? But now that the 13th Amendment was established, the Civil War was over, you will have kind of the Bible Belt unleashed. And so you have the beginning of this extreme reform Protestant movements throughout the South. That's why it's called the Bible Belt. Baptist and Methodist churches are very prevalent throughout this region. Think about like in Waco, how many Baptist and Methodist churches we have. Like they're almost on every street corner. From my classroom at University High School, we could look out the windows and see that Baptist church right across the street from our school. Or if we look over on the old Robinson Road? Whatever that road is on the other side of the school, there's that other church, right? But they're very prevalent. And one of the main things that they're focusing on now after the Civil War, these reform movements are going to be prohibition, trying to end, the consumption of alcohol in America because that was seen as a sin. They're trying to outlaw other sinful behaviors in society as well. So trying to outlaw prostitution. And they're going to be trying to basically help out the poor. That's part of the social gospel movement. And you're going to have a lot of these reform movements become a lot more political, become a lot more lobbyist in nature, and a lot more organized, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And that's going to be led by Frances Willard during its height. It had over 100,000 members, became international. They're not only going to be fighting for temperance, which is, to end people's consumption of alcohol, prohibition, in other words, but also they're going to be fighting for the women's right to vote, women's suffrage, because if women could vote, a lot of women would vote against alcohol. And so those two things go hand in hand. Jane Addams, by the way, pictured there, she is a reformist who is going to be creating the Whole Houses in Chicago. And we'll see these in other cities develop as well. But it was basically a home for the poor and for immigrant children to learn English, to get a roof over their heads, to get food. It was a means of helping the urban poor. Okay, and the very last thing in this lecture today, some of the major labor strikes and violence you need to be aware of from the Gilded Age. The 1880s, the 1877 Great Railroad Strike, we already talked about in Pittsburgh. That was the first major one. The Haymarket Affair in 1886 is the biggest labor strike and labor violence in America's history. It was caused by the May Day is the celebration of labor, May 1st. And the very first ever May Day was celebrated May 1st, 1886. And it accompanied some violence at the Chicago McCormick Reaper factory, where one of the workers was killed while they were striking. So several days later, on May 3rd, 1886, there is a huge crowd that gathers in the Haymarket Square in downtown Chicago to protest the death of this factory worker at the McCormick factory. And they're championing an 8-hour workday and marching through the streets and, doing this big strike. We demand better pay. We demand an 8-hour workday. There was a lot of organization for the protest, for the strike done by the Knights of Labor. And nobody knows exactly who did it, but somebody threw a bomb, maybe some type of makeshift, Molotov cocktail type bomb, into the crowd, killing a police officer in the middle of this strike, in the middle of this protest. And the police respond with chaos, basically not knowing where it came from. They begin firing into the crowd, and they kill several civilians and several of their own officers in the confusion and chaos. In the ensuing weeks that follow, there will be a mass effort to arrest the people who began this, who did the bomb. They're never found, but several of the key labor organizers and anarchists do get arrested. 7 of them in total. 4 of them will be executed by hanging. 1 of them commits suicide while in prison awaiting his execution. And then 3, their sentences are commuted in the 1890s. But this Haymarket affair, as it became known, is going to paint the labor movement, the labor unions that were forming, like the Knights of Labor, as extremely dangerous and un-American. And this was a concerted effort by the business leaders in the national government, who was owned by the business leaders at this time, to basically to get rid of the Knights of Labor, and it works. That's why 1886 was the high point of the Knights of Labor, and they'll be going downhill and basically disappearing by the 1890s. The AFL will largely remain unscathed, as they kind of distanced themselves from any of the labor violence that was happening. And remember, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, with Samuel Gompers, was also much more selective in who they would allow into their unions. The Homestead Steel Strike, this was with Andrew Carnegie's big Homestead Steel plant in Pittsburgh. And you have skilled steel workers basically picketing, I guess you'd say is the word, refusing to allow the unskilled workers in to take their jobs. And eventually, the man that Carnegie had in charge, Carnegie was off golfing in Scotland, the floor manager is going to hire the Pinkertons, a local mercenary, or not a local, but the mercenary group, the Pinkertons, to basically to put a halt to the skilled workers strike and get the mill working again. And a pitched battle ensues between the Pinkertons and the steelworkers, and several are killed. And eventually, the steelworkers are defeated. But yikes! And then finally, the Pullman strike. This was again around Chicago. This was at Pullman's factory. He built luxury sleeper cars for trains. Those are the kind that you can have like a bed that folds down and stuff in, so you can sleep while you're on a train ride. And the factory workers who made these cars, they were forced to sleep and live and shop and everything in the town that Pullman had built next to his factory. He had his own grocery store, post office, everything. And of course, the price of all the goods at the Pullman grocery store and the price for the workers' rent at the Pullman, apartment buildings and stuff was all like way more than what he was paying them at the factory, and they were forced to live there. And so because of these extreme harsh conditions, the workers protest. And again, that railroad strike, the Pullman strike, it's going to become so big and massive. Chicago is a major railroad hub that it'll halt basically the entire nation's railways. And so the national and the state militias are sent in to put down the strike, to put down the workers. We see this a lot. During the Gilded Age, workers are not being protected by the government. They are actually being stopped by the government because the government is not on their side. All right. With that, we're going to go ahead and end the Gilded Age. Next up, we'll be talking about the Progressive Era when we try to fix some of these problems that were happening. Thank you guys so much. I will talk to you later. Bye.